And this is very different. Most Western music is very kind of blunt at the end of the phrases, or very kind of square.
Neuroscientists have been eager to learn what happens in the brains of listeners who've grown up with Western music, whether classical or popular, when they're exposed to something like İlahi's music.
In a sense, it's like listening to a foreign language that we don't understand. By the age of 5 years old, any human infant has learned the rules and the structure of the music, and the language for that matter, that it's brought up in. The developing child starts to selectively prune out those neural connections that it didn't need. Maybe neural connections it would have used for Persian music, Chinese opera, for Amazonian rainforest music. If the child was born here isn't the issue, it's what the child listens to. And after the age of 10 or 12, it becomes very difficult to learn the rules of another system, as difficult as it is for an adult to learn a second spoken language.
When we listen to music which we're familiar with, where there is certain predictable patterns and rhythms, then our left brain is preferentially activated. And conversely, in more mystical aspects of music, in which pattern recognition is not readily available, and that surprises are dotted through the composition, this will preferentially activate the right hemisphere of our brains.
Ūstad İlahi was not a neuroscientist, but like many great musicians over the centuries, he seems to have instinctively understood that novelty, playing something unexpected, could produce a startling effect in his listeners, perhaps a heightened state of awareness or a sharpening of the senses.
It's been suggested that maybe musicians, pre-literate culture musicians even, somehow short-circuited their way to this scientific knowledge that we now have. But that's, of course, what artists have been doing all along. Artists have figured out ways to exploit the perceptual apparatus that evolution gave us.
When Ūstad İlahi's family and friends spoke of being entranced by his music, they didn't mean falling into a glassy-eyed trance. They meant finding themselves strongly focused.
Because of the tempo changes, in particular in İlahi's music, it's not what we would traditionally think of as trance-inducing music, where the tempo has to stay the same. It doesn't mean it couldn't also invoke a kind of altered state of consciousness. It's just that the mechanism by which it did that isn't as clear, because that type of thing has been relatively less studied.
One of the most remarkable aspects about our brains is this concept of plasticity. So this concept of how experience actually shapes and sculptures our brain function is widely accepted amongst neuroscientists at this point. And certainly music and exposure to various types of music not only can change the function of the brain, but also can change the actual structure of the brain as well.
He was very much aware of what he was doing in keeping people's immediate attention focused on the present of these kind of small substructures in the phrase. So when you're listening to this music and you're constantly being kind of interrupted and challenged with the length of these smaller groupings within the bigger phrase, you can't help but be alert.
Certainly music can induce a kind of hyper-vigilant or hyper-conscious state where you're not out of it, but you're more in it than usual, more focused, more responsive, sort of in a peak state. This is the state that super athletes, Olympic athletes are in, that an improviser is in, a painter, somebody who's at the top of their game, and music can promote this, although through means that we don't fully understand.
We can talk about how İlahi might have used his music to create this heightened state of awareness in his mind and in his listeners, but it's more difficult to talk about why. Was this effect intentional, or was it a byproduct of the music's deep spiritual and mystical roots?
I don't know to what extent a kind of a teleological question is justified, but one can ask nonetheless, what is the purpose of that? Well, the purpose of that may be to somehow combine in the same experience both the trance-like, devoid of frontal lobe presence, and the rational, infused with frontal lobe presence into the same experience, which is a pretty ambitious enterprise.
For İlahi, improvisation was the essence of his music, the way to bridge the worlds of the trance state and the rational, the familiar and the unfamiliar.
He's an exciting improviser because he just works away at a particular phrase and the ornaments are flying out at high speed and he's developing an idea here and another one there, and then he'll suddenly bring in a chord unexpectedly.
Real beautiful works of art in music are able to engage both aspects of our brain function, the world of the known and the world of the unknown.
Ustad maintained contact with a number of Iranian musicians and studied with the great musical masters of his time. Eventually, he synthesized classical Persian music into the traditional repertoire of the tanbur. He would occasionally play for small groups of family and friends, but as a musician, he was almost completely unknown. That began to change in 1960, when one of the musicians who heard him play wrote about his experience in a magazine article. One of the people who read that article was the man credited with saving traditional Persian music in the 1970s, the musicologist Dariush Safat. Marufi's article lamented the poor state of music on the radio in Iran and compared it to the extraordinary music of an unnamed judge who played the tanbur and whose music had a profound impact.
بهار 1339 مرحوم استاد موسای معروفی موسی خان ایشون مقاله‌ای نوشتن درباره موسیقی و موسیقیدان. گفتن این یک بزرگواری است که شخصیت بزرگیه و قاضی عالی رتبه دادگستری بودن و ایشون بازنشسته هستن و مایل نیستن که اسم ایشون اصلا مطرح شه.
Marufi told Dr. Safat that İlahi's music put him in a transcendent state of mind. I was in a state, Marufi said, where I was not bound by time or space. I had a feeling of being in a peak state, filled with love and compassion. Safat sought out İlahi and would later say that İlahi was the single biggest influence on his life and work. That work included founding the Center for Preservation and Propagation of Iranian Music, where some of Iran's greatest musicians were exposed to İlahi's music, including the singer Parisa.
خوشبختانه این شانس رو داشتم که با دکتر داریوش صفوت آشنا بشم که خب ایشون هم نوازنده ستار بودن و مرکز حفظ و اشاعه رو ایشون تأسیس کرده بودن. من رو آشنا کردن با موسیقی استاد و اینکه اصلا موسیقی با چه کیفیتی داشته باشه. آشنا شدم با اندیشه های استاد و موسیقی استاد.
In the late 1960s, the Shiraz Persepolis International Arts Festival began taking place. That brought Western artists, musicians, and intellectuals to Iran and opened the country up to many Europeans for the first time. Some of the world's most famous actresses, like Elizabeth Taylor or Ellen Burstyn, and international figures like the Kennedys were among the Westerners who visited Iran around this time. The area around the city of Shiraz was a hub of cultural and artistic exchange. Ūstad İlahi, true to form, was not a part of the scene. He stayed at home, continuing to play his music for his family and some close friends and the occasional visitor. But word of his playing traveled fast, and a number of visiting artists made their way to see him. Among them was the internationally famous violinist Yehudi Menuhin.
Jamais je n'ai eu, pendant au moins une demi-heure, une expérience musicale qui ne bougeait pas, qui ne dépassait pas la carte. Et une musique très sensible, très intense, mais aussi très précise et très pure.
Another visitor was the great French choreographer Maurice Béjart.
Il ne parlait pas français, je ne parlais pas iranien, il a joué pour moi, j'ai dansé sur cette musique et ça m'a vraiment ouvert quelque chose. Mais je ne peux pas dire avec des mots ce que, non, ce que j'ai vécu, ressenti. Ce qui est que ça a été quand même un très grand changement dans ma vie, dans mon existence et dans ma pensée.
Ūstad İlahi spent most of his retirement with his family and people who came from various places to visit him. He authored several books based on his research, experience, and philosophy. These works were, in many ways, informed by his early life as a mystic and his later work as a jurist. They reflect a distinctly personal approach to questions about purpose and meaning and self-awareness. What he could say in words, he did. What he could not say in words, he said through his music.
Je n'ai pas un souvenir plus, disons, marquant que l'autre. Je ne peux pas, par exemple, vous dire tel souvenir était meilleur que l'autre. Par contre, je pourrais dire, mon pire souvenir, c'était lorsqu'il a quitté ce monde et après, je me suis trouvé vraiment orphelin sur le plan musical. Ça, je pourrais dire.
He passed away in 1974 in his house in Tehran, with his family and a few friends around him. He was 79. 2 decades after his death, Ūstاد İlahi finally made a record. A series of them, in fact, as the home recordings made by his son Bahram were released on the French Chant du Monde label. It was 1995, the centennial of İlahi's birth.
I've watched with fascination as more and more people in unlikely walks of life began to discover his music.
After the recordings came the museum exhibitions. The Musée de la Musique in Paris. And the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. The Sacred Lute, the art of Ūstاد İlahi, opened in New York in August of 2014. As museum exhibits go, it was modest in size, but it proved to be a surprising success, drawing over 100,000 visitors and attracting media attention from around the world, including the New York Times and PBS.
Iranian-born musician and philosopher Ūstاد İlahi lived from 1895 to 1974. During his lifetime,
the exhibition included İlahi's own manuscripts and instruments, and the live performance of Ūstاد İlahi's music by his son Shahrokh in the museum's auditorium.
The ultimate musical experience is to be taken away with some kind of soaring quality that you've never experienced before. That's why we listen to music.
These pieces are meant to connect you with a different part of yourself that otherwise would be less accessible.
I think it was the first thing I heard, this Yellow Shahi suite. This is still the one I go back to. It's a really great long exploration. He was playing the March of the Angels, following the beat of their march.
And this music so beautifully represents the dynamic interface between order and chaos, between light and dark. And to have all these components in a composition in music really represents the apex of creativity and human consciousness.
Persian works of art, especially those with a mystical dimension, have mirror-like qualities. The idea is to achieve self-knowledge and to transform oneself, becoming better and wiser human beings.
It is really to be understood as mystical poetry, and that means that there are meanings. One can attain them, one can reach them through a kind of mystical understanding.
He basically believed something from which the music flowed, And that kind of basic way of approaching music, I think, is fantastic.
At first you think, is this Iranian classical music? Is it some kind of folk music from the Middle East? And I gradually realized it was a completely unique, very personal take on everything he'd heard through his life and the process of this complete involvement with his instrument, the tambour.
And let's not forget that he was playing this music for a few people in a room. He had no idea that I would be listening to this music in Toronto 30 years after his death, and that he would be inspiring people around the world.
You go to İlahi for a kind of spiritual depth in the music, an utter commitment to his own vision on that instrument.
We can be filled with music, but in order to communicate it, in order to share it, we have to actually learn to play. And from Ostad's point of view, life is really about learning to play the instrument of the soul.
Il disait toujours, la musique est en rapport direct avec l'âme, et l'âme direct avec le créateur de l'âme.
There's literally another world there above the fundamental vibrating sounds of the strings that you can completely miss. And in life, we can walk around and look at the surface of things, and we can miss a lot of things that are going on.
The fact that he decided to change his life course so dramatically, and of course keep music essentially as a core part of that, and move into his life as a judge and engaging the world, so to speak, is also extremely admirable. Well, that means that anybody, any of us, has no excuse. That basically, whatever you're doing, it's that integrated approach to life which engages the world, but it's also part of, who you are deeply as an artist.
What Ustad İlahi's life shows us is that when we look back at the historical accounts or the mythical accounts of the great sages of the past, and sometimes wonder to ourselves, could such an extraordinary person have really lived and walked this earth? The answer has to be yes, because here's one of them who was recently among us.
Mm-hmm.